Welcome to today's deep dive. If you're joining us, you're likely someone who tracks the shifting currents in technology and economics.
Right. Someone who wants to look past those superficial headlines.
Exactly. You want to understand the actual mechanics of what's happening in the professional world right now. And our mission today is to unpack a structural shift in the job market that is, frankly, it's completely redefining the concept of the career trajectory.
It really is.
We're looking at an insightful dialogue excerpt titled The Youth Freeze, How AI Pulls Up the Career Ladder. And this is centered entirely around a recently released paper from Anthropic. The data we are looking at is fresh. We're talking March 2026.
Which is such a pivotal piece of research. What Anthropic has done here is move past all that theoretical forecasting.
We're guesswork.
Yeah, the guesswork that dominated the last few years. They looked at the actual empirical hiring data in sectors that are heavily saturated by artificial intelligence. And it forces us to reconcile what we assumed would happen with what is actually playing out on the ground right now.
Right. And to really grasp the weight of this March 2026 data, we have to look at the contrast with the prevailing economic models from just a few years ago. I mean, think back to 2023.
Oh, man, 2023.
Right. If you were active in professional networks or following the tech sector, the consensus was essentially this countdown to structural unemployment.
Yeah, the doom scrolling was everywhere.
The doom scrolling. The prevailing narrative was that the robots are coming for everyone's jobs. Automation capabilities were scaling so fast that a massive wave of layoffs across white-collar, creative, and technical fields was just imminent.
Because the assumption was a highly linear equation.
Like the technology acquires the capability to do a task, and therefore the human currently doing that task is immediately let go.
Which, logically, it made sense at the time. I mean, if you were only looking at the capability benchmarks of the models.
Sure.
That bunker mentality was pervasive because the raw output of the technology was suddenly rivaling human baseline performance. We were bracing for the factory doors to close, metaphorically speaking.
But for knowledge workers.
Exactly.
For the knowledge workers.
But that linear equation is exactly what this new Anthropic paper dismantles. Here we are, March 2026, and the hard data presents a massive paradox. It completely subverts that expectation of sudden mass unemployment.
It's totally upside down.
Yeah. The reality of the disruption is much quieter. It's much more systemic and highly dependent on exactly which demographic you happen to fall into.
Right. For one group, the data is remarkably stabilizing.
But for another, it points to a very hostile barrier to entry.
And that paradox is the engine of this entire discussion. The disruption has absolutely arrived, but it hasn't manifested as a wave of pink slips for established professionals. The corporate economy absorbed the technological shock differently than the forecasters predicted.
Let's get right into that first major finding from the Anthropic paper because it directly addresses the stabilization you just mentioned. The data shows that unemployment has not spiked in these vulnerable sectors.
It really hasn't. Even in the roles that analysts agreed were the most highly exposed to AI automation, specifically fields like software engineering and financial analysis. Nobody is getting fired. The established professionals, the veteran coders, the senior financial analysts, they are keeping their jobs.
Which initially looks like a complete contradiction of the capability metrics because the models are writing functional code.
They're generating complex financial models.
Yeah. Yet, the human workforce in those specific exposed sectors is holding its ground. And Anthropic didn't just report this anomaly, they dug into the mechanics of it and identified a dynamic they're calling observed exposure.
Okay, let's unpack this. Because understanding observed exposure is critical to figuring out why the layoff wave never materialized. How does the paper define this dynamic in a practical day-to-day corporate environment?
So observed exposure is a framework that separates the technical capability of an AI from the operational reality of corporate management. What the data shows is that just because a system possesses the technical capacity to execute a workflow, say running a Monte Carlo simulation on financial data or automating an API integration,
Sure.
it does not mean the management layer is actually authorizing it to operate autonomously. The exposure to automation is observed, meaning the capability is recognized, but the human is not being removed from the loop.
But wait, if the tool can undeniably do the work, wouldn't a board of directors eventually force the issue? Like if you have a senior developer making $200,000 a year and a tool can do 80% of their workflow, why is corporate management hesitating to cut that salary? Doesn't capitalism usually demand that kind of brutal efficiency?
In theory, yes. But in practice, you run into the friction of enterprise liability, compliance, and institutional trust. And you, as a listener, can probably see this in your own workplace. I mean, have you noticed this gap between what an AI can do and what management is actually letting it do?
I definitely have.
Right. There is a massive gap between an impressive API call and a fully integrated, trusted business process. If a generative financial model hallucinates a data point in a quarterly earnings report, the SEC doesn't care that an algorithm made the mistake.
Oh, that makes total sense. They're not going to find an algorithm.
Exactly. The company needs a licensed, accountable human being to take responsibility. You can't sue an AI. You can't fire a language model for a compliance breach.
So the bureaucracy and the legal frameworks of the corporate world are acting as a shield for these established workers. Management needs a chaperone for the technology.
Precisely. The senior professionals have essentially become the chaperones. They are utilizing the AI to execute the work, vastly increasing their own output, but their physical presence in the seat is still required for accountability.
For high-level verification.
Yeah. The institutional trust simply isn't there yet to hand the steering wheel over entirely. So the veteran financial analysts and the senior engineers are sitting quite comfortably. The exposure is there, but the execution of that exposure is stalled by corporate inertia.
The psychological relief of that for current workers must be huge. They get to keep their jobs, their salaries, and honestly, they probably have an easier workday.
Much easier. They're more productive than ever.
But here's where it gets really interesting, and frankly, where the data reveals the hidden cost of that corporate inertia. We've established that the veterans are safe. But there's a massive catch in this March 2026 data.
A huge catch.
If you are a 22-year-old right now, perhaps a recent graduate trying to break into these AI-heavy fields, the landscape is incredibly unforgiving. Anthropic's paper tracks a phenomenon they've termed the youth freeze.
And this is where the reassurance of the low unemployment rate completely evaporates. When you slice the employment data demographically, the stability we just discussed is entirely concentrated in the older cohorts. The entry-level ecosystem is collapsing.
The breakdown is stark.
Yeah.
The paper highlights a specific hard statistic. Hiring for 22 to 25-year-olds in AI-heavy fields has plummeted by 14%.
14%.
That is a massive drop for a specific demographic trying to enter the workforce, especially in sectors that are ostensibly booming with new technological capabilities.
What's fascinating here is the silent nature of this shift. As a society, we are conditioned to recognize economic distress through subtraction. We look for layoffs.
Right, severance packages, departmental cuts.
Exactly. But the youth freeze is an economic disruption of omission. It's not about people being pushed out of the system. It's about people never being allowed to enter in the first place.
It is an invisible lockout. You don't see a headline in the Financial Times about a 22-year-old NYU graduate not getting hired for a junior modeling role.
Because the veteran workers are still employed, the top-line economic indicators look perfectly healthy, but underneath that surface, the entry doors have been quietly bolted shut.
It's highly targeted structural friction. The senior workers are insulated by their institutional knowledge and their role as accountable chaperones. But the 22 to 25 demographic, the cohort that relies on entry-level positions to build that very institutional knowledge.
They are absorbing the entirety of the efficiency gains created by these AI tools. To understand why the specific group is taking the hit, we have to look at the changing mechanics of daily workflows.
The source dialogue provides a very grounded framework for this by looking at the dynamic between senior and junior roles, specifically in software development. Let's walk through this because it highlights exactly how the productivity trap functions.
Okay.
Think about the traditional apprenticeship model in tech or finance before integrated AI agents became ubiquitous. It relied heavily on foundational, often tedious tasks.
Right. Let's use the developer ecosystem as the baseline. A senior architect would design the complex infrastructure, but the implementation inherently involved grunt work.
Syntax errors, edge case testing.
Dependency flagging, basic debugging. The senior developer didn't have the bandwidth to manually comb through thousands of lines of code to fix every minor issue.
So they handed it off. That was the entire function of the junior developer. The 22-year-old would take the senior's code, review the pull requests, run the mock compiles, and fix the bugs before it hit staging.
And it wasn't just a job, it was a subsidized training ground. The junior learned the architecture by fixing the senior's mistakes.
Exactly. It was an experiential learning pipeline disguised as a job description. But let's look at the March 2026 reality detailed in the Anthropic paper.
That same senior developer now has an integrated AI agent right in their development environment. They write the architecture, and the AI instantly runs the mock compile, flags the dependency errors, and suggests the fixes before the code is even committed.
The senior developer is suddenly operating at twice the speed.
Which leads us to the core of the productivity paradox. Because the senior developer is now a hyper-efficient, self-contained unit, the necessity of the handoff disappears.
Why would a senior professional take the time to assign a debugging task to a 22-year-old, wait for them to process it, and then review their work, when the AI agent handles the entire QA process autonomously in seconds?
They wouldn't. The friction of managing a junior employee now outweighs the benefit of their labor. The technology hasn't replaced the senior developer. It has simply absorbed the foundational tasks that used to define entry-level work.
And you can apply this exact same logic to the financial sector.
Absolutely. The veteran analyst doesn't need a junior associate to scrape quarterly earnings and build a baseline financial model anymore. They prompt an LLM to generate the baseline, and then they spend their time analyzing it. The high-level work remains. The foundational work is automated.
The source material uses a really powerful metaphor to illustrate this structural freeze-out. We should spend some time unpacking it because it perfectly captures the asymmetry of what is happening. The dialogue states, the ladder's being pulled up.
Yeah.
And then it refines that by adding, we aren't firing the people on the roof, we're just removing the stairs for everyone else.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, the imagery of the roof and the stairs really gets to the heart of the modern economic trap we've engineered. Think of these AI-heavy professions as a structure. Up on the roof, you have the senior developers, the veteran analysts, the experienced project managers.
And they are secure.
Very secure. Their institutional knowledge makes them indispensable, and AI has simply given them better tools. They are enjoying unprecedented productivity up there.
But the only way to get to the roof is by climbing the stairs. And those stairs represent the junior roles, the associate positions, the entry-level stepping stones that allow a 22-year-old to accumulate the experience necessary to eventually become a senior professional.
Right. And what the Anthropic data proves is that hyper-efficiency at the top is accidentally but systematically dismantling the entry points at the bottom. By giving the people on the roof the tools to do the work of 3 people, the market has removed the economic incentive to maintain the staircase.
The 14% drop in youth hiring isn't a temporary dip.
No, it's the structural reality of those stairs being torn down.
It's a chilling dynamic, especially because it isn't driven by malice. The board of directors isn't actively conspiring to lock a generation out of the workforce. The senior developer isn't trying to hoard opportunities.
Everyone is simply acting rationally. They are using the tools available to get their own work done faster and more accurately.
But the byproduct of that localized individual efficiency is a massive systemic freeze-out at the bottom. We have built an ecosystem where experience is massively amplified by AI, but inexperience is rendered completely economically unviable.
And that fundamentally breaks the social contract of professional development. The entry-level tier wasn't just cheap labor. It was the mechanism by which industries transferred skills from one generation to the next.
When you optimize the grunt work out of existence, you aren't just saving money on a junior salary, you are actively shutting down the training pipeline for the entire sector.
You are demanding that new entrants already possess the skills of someone who has been on the roof for 5 years without giving them the stairs to climb to get there.
Which makes breaking into these fields right now an incredibly daunting prospect. If you are that 22-year-old, you are looking up at a booming, highly productive industry. But the physical infrastructure to join it simply doesn't exist in the way it did even 3 years ago. The entry point has been abstracted away by an algorithm.
This is why the observed exposure concept is so critical. The exposure didn't result in layoffs. It resulted in a hiring freeze. The AI didn't take the senior's job. It took the junior's opportunity to learn the senior's job.
So what does this all mean? If we distill the findings from this March 2026 Anthropic paper, we are left looking at a vastly different economic landscape than anyone predicted. The assumption that automation would create a sudden wave of mass unemployment across white-collar sectors was wrong. Corporate friction, compliance, and the need for human accountability created a shield for established professionals.
But the cost of that stability was quietly passed down to the youngest members of the workforce.
That staggering 14% drop in hiring for 22 to 25-year-olds reveals an invisible lockout. The entry-level roles, the junior coders, the baseline financial modelers, they are vanishing because the veteran workers, armed with integrated AI agents, no longer need to delegate the foundational work. The latter is quite literally being pulled up, leaving a vital demographic stranded without a way to begin their careers.
This raises an important question, and it's a structural vulnerability that industries will have to reckon with sooner rather than later. If the entry-level stairs are permanently removed and 22-year-olds no longer have a subsidized environment to do the foundational debugging and modeling work, how do they actually acquire the experiential knowledge required to be a senior professional?
That is the million-dollar question.
Where exactly is the next generation of veteran workers supposed to come from? If the market refuses to let anyone onto the ladder today, who is going to be left to stand on the roof tomorrow when the current cohort of senior professionals eventually retires?
That is exactly the kind of long-term consequence that makes this data so vital to understand. And it's kind of complex dynamic we love unpacking with you. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the Anthropic paper. We hope this exploration has given you a much clearer lens through which to view the current realities of the job market. Keep questioning the narratives, keep looking closely at the data behind the headlines, and we will catch you on the next deep dive.